I'm presenting today on my contribution to the special issue. And my contribution is called The Environmental Pedagogies of BIPOC Women's Cultural Countermapping, Ecological Learning Through Interrelationality, Geontology and Cardinal Ethics. In the paper, I examine the connections between geontologic and interrelational theories of place and how countermapping practices offer important methodological and pedagogic lessons in environmental sustainability education. In the paper, I centralise the cultural countermapping undertaken by BIPOC women and the importance of this work in directing how cardinal ethics and mapping underpin ecological learning. I use Elizabeth Povinelli's Geontologies, Rosie Briodotti's Post-Human Knowledge, and Felix Guattari's Three Ecologies in relation with concepts of interrelationality in BIPOC scholarship. And I explore specifically the concept of belonging as written by Bell Hooks and Aileen Morton Robinson, and the constellatory as written by Emily Johnson and Karen Recollet. And I use these to propose how interrelational theories and geontologies reside in such scholarship and are central to environmental and sustainability learning. I then exemplify the impacts of BIPOC countermapping practices on environmental sustainability education through a research creation project into the devastating ecological effects of the 2019 and 2020 Australian bushfires, and using the concept of cardinal ethics and a methodological protocol called inefficient mapping, I map emergent data into the red list of Australian biodiversity facing dangerous levels of depletion after the fires. And I conclude the paper by describing the guidance and learning offered by BIPOC women's countermapping in theorising ecological knowledge in the Anthropocene. So important lessons can be learned from practices of countermapping by Black, Indigenous and people of colour, or BIPOC, about ecological relationships and how these environmental relationships offer expansive ideas for ecological sustainability pedagogies and learning. And I use the BIPOC acronym throughout my paper with awareness of the tensions that arise from compressing diversity, and that acronyms such as BIPOC are essentially an English language strategy. So I fully appreciate it's a much richer term than that very simple acronym. However, I use the BIPOC acronym to indicate that the paper focuses on rich practices of mapping by First Nations communities, as well as groups who would not identify themselves as First Nations, but neither as colonial or white. So countermapping creatively enact concepts and theories in the context of environmental sustainability, and those concepts are geontologic and interrelational, and these are poured into the processes of orienting, wayfaring, inscribing, reading and relating to land, place and location. And I examine onto-epistemological connections between geontologic and interrelational theories and BIPOC scholarship of place to explore conceptualizations of the relationalities we have to location. I collate concepts of belonging, the post-human, the constellatory, place and ecosophy from different cultural and subjective standpoints to propose interrelational and geontologic theories practiced in countermapping establish connections between geographies, environments, bodies, subjectivities and cultural belonging. And the cluster of theories richly informs ecological practices, and these urgently are needed to expand on environmental sustainability education approaches beyond the colonial. And I introduced the term cardinal ethics to understand the motivations for mapping and how these are imbricated in practices that maintain cultural relationships between bodies, things, beings, elements and place. And learning about BIPOC cartographic ontologies and practices helps understand how cardinal ethics emerge from the multidimensional interrelationalities. And in this context, mapping isn't simply an inscription of the Earth's surface, but orients and locates across deeply interwoven connections. And so I cite 4 examples in the paper of women's countermapping projects as examples of cardinal ethical mapping in practice, and I'll just run through those now. And the first one is Mishuana Goman's remapping project, which uses a countermapping practice to address the lives and experiences of Native women in Canada or Turtle Island. And in remapping, Goman explored how Native women's literature projects contest colonial spatial orderings through temporal narratives that, quote, branch into the past, present, and future, end quote. The next is the Bawaka Collective, made up of the Gewu group of women, and how the collective performs song spirals as a yongu onto epistemologic practice for mapping. And they explain how song spirals map, quote, in a different way, a deep mapping. It helps us find our way. We learn the land itself, end quote. The third group or example is the constellatory mappings in Light and Dark Matter by the artists and scholars Emily Johnson and Karen Recollet. And this project explores concepts of kinship, care, and, quote, radical relationality, end quote, across elements, matters, and registers. And the constellatory uses the relational agency of fire and how it elementally brings collective acts such as, quote, gathering, witnessing, and accomplishing, end quote, into play. And the final of the 4 is written up by Candace Fujikani, who surveys the activist mapping practices of the traditional Kanaka Maoli communities of Hawaii. And the projects initiated by community elders and women use collective and inventive approaches such as bus tours, citizen science records, and local government appeals to protest building proposals by property developers and the environmental damage caused to underground aquifers by subterranean fuel tankers installed by US armed forces. And through these 4 examples, I propose that women's cultural mapping practices provide important environmental education lessons. And BIPOC environmental education is seen as cartographic, multi-perspectival, extending on the geologic surface and into the sky and deep below. And the stories, songs, and corporeal practices reflect conceptions of an ever-evolving life across registers, frames, and affects. And the examples demonstrate that countermapping is a vibrant method for communities to work collectively for common goals. And this reframes the map from being a disciplinary representational tool to one that activates communities in fluid and emergent ways in inscribing the land for other reasons. And I must state at this point, I do not speak on behalf of BIPOC communities. I am a white, non-Indigenous woman, and so this is really important to state. I cannot talk from a first-person experience of colonisation, nor of countermapping, as I'm not privy to the deep details of Indigenous place ontologies and relationalities. I wrote this paper because I'm provoked to think about how BIPOC mapping practices offer alternatives to colonial approaches to environmental education, and how these practices influence my work and decolonise my mapping practice away from a colonial interest to know of, use, and to appropriate. And BIPOC women's scholarship, for me, needs to be recognised, so I pay full credit to the BIPOC artists, intellectuals, cultures, and scholars that influence my geontologic understandings. And the paper then goes on to discuss my practice of inefficient mapping and how, as an experimental method, it supports ethical, political, ecological research that encourages white scholars such as myself to acknowledge our subjectivity and the ongoing impacts of colonisation in practice. And I discuss my project, Mapping Extinction, which charts the impacts of the bushfires on nature biodiversity loss. And the mappings reference the red list of species deeply impacted by the fires. And each work features a mock specimen drawing of particular flora or fauna drawn in blue as a direct pun on a blueprint and a comment on ecological precarity. And these cultural countermapping guides how inefficient mapping can be a critical settler cartographic practice for use in environmental projects by advocating for being physically or intellectually present with the location, practicing a cardinal ethics in order to map place. And the influence of BIPOC countermapping critiques making maps for people to wayfind over land they have never been to before. And this is a colonial practice of orienting that decontextualizes land and reduces it to a series of topographic schemas and markers to follow. And so this, rather than being with a place and coming to know its rich associations and significance, treats the land as a surface to traverse. So going back to this project, as an experimental method, inefficient mapping engages in ethical, political, ecological research that performs the politics of environmental sustainability in the Anthropocene. Its research creation approach addresses extractivism and strives for decolonial readings of the world. And the women's cultural countermapping projects that I cite encourage detailed readings of colonial impacts on the land and environment. And Personally, I tread more critically and carefully because of their work. So in conclusion, I advocate in this paper for the importance of centralising experimental countermapping research creation methods and the crucial work by BIPOC women in informing high quality environmental sustainability education. Thank you for listening to my paper.